Breakups are rough, but this one, it hit me harder than I ever expected. 4 years of my life, gone, and I wasn't handling it well. I couldn't sleep, I wasn't eating much, and my friends were worried about me. They kept insisting I get out of the house, so eventually I gave in. That's how I ended up at a party in Midtown Atlanta that night. It was loud, packed, and honestly, the last place I wanted to be. I nursed a drink in the corner, forcing a smile, while everyone around me laughed and danced. My friends meant well, but they didn't understand. After a while, I couldn't fake it anymore. I told them I was heading home and slipped out the door. It was a crisp, cool night. The streets were quiet except for the occasional car passing by. I pulled out my phone, looking for the fastest way back to my apartment. That's when I noticed the GPS suggesting a shortcut. It led straight through Oakland Cemetery. I hesitated. I'd walked through cemeteries before, during the day. At night, not so much, but it was late, I was tired, and I just wanted to get home. So I took the path. The gate creaked as I pushed it open. The moment I stepped inside, the air felt different, heavy. The smell of damp earth and stone hit me immediately. Shadows stretched unnaturally long under the dim glow of the streetlights beyond the gate. But I kept walking, hands shoved into my pockets, telling myself it was fine. At first, it was just quiet, eerily quiet. I could hear my own footsteps crunching on the gravel path. But then, I heard it. Footsteps, behind me. They were soft at first, almost blending into the sound of the wind. But as I kept walking, they grew louder, more deliberate. Someone was following me. I stopped and turned around. Nothing. Just rows of old headstones, some tilted at odd angles, stretching out into the darkness. I stood there for a moment, scanning the shadows, but the path was empty. I shook it off, laughing at myself for being paranoid, and kept moving. That's when I saw it. Near one of the mausoleums, maybe 50 feet ahead of me, there was someone standing there, a figure, completely still. Almost blending into the darkness, my heart started racing. I couldn't make out much, just the outline of a person, tall and thin. I called out, "Hey, you okay?" My voice echoed back to me, no response. And then, it moved. Not like a person, though. It didn't walk. It glided, as if its feet weren't touching the ground. My chest tightened. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs felt like lead. I stood frozen until the figure began to move faster, coming straight at me. I bolted. I ran as fast as I could, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might explode. The sound of footsteps chased me, matching my pace, but no matter how fast I went, I couldn't shake it. I reached the gates and practically threw myself through them, landing hard on the pavement outside. For a moment, everything was silent. The footsteps stopped. I turned back toward the gate, and there it was, the figure, standing just inside the cemetery, watching me. I didn't stick around. I ran all the way home, not stopping until I slammed my apartment door shut behind me. It wasn't until I caught my breath that I noticed it. My neck was burning. I reached up and felt something wet. When I pulled my hand away, it was smeared with blood. 3 long, deep scratches ran across my skin as if something or someone had clawed me. The next day, I told my friend Ryan what had happened. He didn't believe me, but he agreed to come back with me during the day. We retraced my steps, walking past the same mausoleum where I'd seen the figure. That's when Ryan stopped. "Dude," he whispered, pointing to a headstone near the mausoleum. The stone looked ancient, weathered by time, but that wasn't what caught our attention. The top of it was smeared with something dark, dried, and flaky. Blood. Old blood. I haven't set foot near that cemetery since. I'll never forget that night. I was coming home from a late shift at the diner, and I decided to take the last train instead of waiting for a ride. I had just moved to the city and didn't know the late-night train routes too well, but the convenience was tempting. The platform was nearly empty, with just a few scattered people waiting, and the train itself looked normal, the usual low hum of its engines, lights flickering as it pulled in. I boarded and found an empty seat near the back. At first, everything seemed fine, but as the train started moving, I realized something was off. It was too quiet. No chatter, no soft music from headphones, no faint rustling of newspapers, just silence. I glanced around, trying to spot anyone else in the car. That's when I noticed him. Across from me, an elderly man sat perfectly still, his face obscured by the brim of an old worn-out hat. At first, I didn't think much of it. He could have been sleeping, but the longer I sat there, the more I noticed something unsettling. He wasn't moving at all, not even the subtle rise and fall of his chest. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself I was just tired, but when I looked back, I noticed something else. His hands. They were resting in his lap, but they didn't look right. The skin was shriveled, almost skeletal, like they'd been left out in the sun for too long. My stomach tightened. I looked away quickly, focusing on my phone, but the eerie silence made it impossible to concentrate. When I finally worked up the nerve to glance back, my heart nearly stopped. He wasn't sitting still anymore. His head was tilted up and his face was turned toward me. His eyes were wide open, staring directly at me, and his pupils were pitch black. I froze, my body locked in place. The train slowed as we approached the next station, and I silently begged for more people to get on. The doors opened, but no one boarded. The man, however, stood up. His movements were slow, deliberate, and every step he took made my heart pound harder. I bolted to the next car, my legs trembling as I slammed through the doors. The train started moving again, and when I turned back, he was gone. I exhaled sharply, trying to calm down. Maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe I was just exhausted. But then I heard it. A faint whisper, so close, it felt like it was right in my ear. "You can't escape." I spun around, expecting to see him standing behind me, but there was no one there. The car was empty. My skin prickled as I pressed myself into a corner, my eyes darting around. When the train finally reached the last stop, I practically flew out the doors and ran to the station attendant. I stammered out what had happened, but he just gave me a blank look. "There wasn't anyone else in your car," he said. I didn't know what to say. I just nodded and walked out into the cold night air, my mind racing. To this day, I avoid taking the train late at night. And sometimes, when I'm alone in a quiet room, I swear I can still hear that whisper, "You can't escape." I never believed in ghosts. At least, not until I moved into that old apartment building. The place was cheap, which should have been my first red flag. The floors creaked with every step, and the walls were so thin you could hear your neighbors arguing over dinner. But I was broke, and it was all I could afford. It wasn't long before I noticed her. Across the street, in the building opposite mine, there was a window. And every night, like clockwork, she was there. A woman, standing perfectly still, staring out. Her face was pale, almost lifeless, and her long, dark hair seemed to melt into the shadows of the room behind her. At first, I thought it was just a weird neighbor. But as the days went by, I realized she never moved. She didn't blink, didn't shift her weight. Nothing. It was like she was frozen in time. I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was overthinking. But one night, curiosity got the better of me. I waved at her from my window, hoping for some kind of reaction. She didn't move. My chest tightened, and I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. That's when I noticed something odd about the window she was standing at. It wasn't open. In fact, it looked boarded up from the inside. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I stepped back, my pulse racing, but before I could turn away, I heard something. A faint whisper carried by the still night air. "Why didn't you say hello?" My heart leapt into my throat. I spun around, expecting to see someone behind me, but I was alone. The room felt colder, like the temperature had dropped suddenly. The next day, I decided to ask my landlord about the building across the street. His face paled when I described the woman. "You've seen her?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, and he shook his head. "That window's been boarded up for years. There's no one living there." I didn't believe him. I couldn't. That night, I decided to prove it to myself. I went across the street and stood outside the building. I looked up at the window, and there she was, staring down at me. Summoning all my courage, I stepped inside the building. The air was thick and stale, and every creak of the floorboards echoed like a gunshot. I climbed the stairs, my heart pounding harder with every step. When I reached the door to the apartment with the boarded-up window, I hesitated. The door was slightly ajar, and the darkness inside felt alive. I pushed it open, and there she was, standing in front of the window, her back to me. "Hello?" I whispered, my voice shaking. She turned slowly, her pale face expressionless, and her eyes locked onto mine. For a moment, we just stared at each other. Then she spoke, her voice barely audible. "You saw me." I don't remember running back to my apartment, but I must have, because I woke up in my bed, drenched in sweat. I haven't seen her since, but sometimes, late at night, I feel like someone's watching me,